Sign it, Daniel Whitmore said, sliding the contract across the glass table, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind that usually ended conversations before they began, and around him the boardroom breathed in quiet agreement, leather chairs creaking, pens tapping, a few low chuckles drifting as Naomi Brooks stepped forward with a silver tray, refilling water no one really needed, her reflection faint in the polished surface, her name badge slightly crooked against a plain navy uniform that made her easy to ignore, easier to dismiss. And when a single drop slipped from the rim of the pitcher and landed on the edge of the document, one of the executives leaned back with a smirk. "Careful there," he muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear. "We can't have the help rewriting the deal." A ripple of laughter followed, soft but sharp, the kind that didn't need volume to sting, and Naomi paused, just for a second, her fingers tightening around the handle, the cool metal pressing into her palm, her heartbeat rising in her ears louder than the air conditioning humming above them, because she had seen this before, not the room, not the people, but the pattern, the line buried in a wall of language that didn't belong, the kind of line that looked harmless until it wasn't, and she tried to move, to step back into the invisible space she was supposed to occupy, but her eyes drifted, pulled like gravity back to page 14, to the clause that didn't sit right, to the numbers that leaned in the wrong direction, to the quiet shift of risk no one had noticed, or maybe no one had bothered to notice, because why would they, when confidence filled the room like oxygen, when Daniel's pen hovered just above the signature line, when everyone believed this was already done, already decided, already theirs, and then she heard it, not a voice, not exactly, more like a memory, late-night fluorescent lights, a forgotten folder left half open, her hands still from wiping the table as her eyes scanned words she wasn't meant to read, the realization hitting slow, then all at once, and now standing here, with laughter still echoing, she felt it again, that same quiet certainty settling in her chest, heavy, undeniable, and before she could stop herself, before the weight of every rule she'd learned about staying quiet could pull her back, she spoke, her voice not loud, but clear enough to cut through the room. "If you sign that, you're taking on all the liability." The laughter didn't stop right away. It twisted, sharpened. Someone exhaled like it was a joke that had gone just a little too far. "Excuse me," another voice said, amused, dismissive, but Daniel didn't laugh. His pen didn't move. It hovered, frozen in the space between decision and doubt, his eyes shifting, not to the executives, not to the lawyers, but to her, really looking for the first time. And in that split second the room changed, not in sound, not yet, but in something deeper, something quieter, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had seemed unbreakable just moments before. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and Naomi could feel every eye in the room shifting, some with irritation, some with curiosity, most with disbelief that she had spoken at all, her hands now still at her sides, the silver tray resting against her hip, cool and steady compared to the heat rising in her chest. And for a moment no one moved until a man near the end of the table let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh. "That is not how this works," he said, shaking his head as if correcting a child. "You are out of line." Another voice added, sharper this time. "This is a closed meeting." But Daniel still had not signed, his pen hovering, his gaze fixed on the page as if the words had suddenly changed shape, and Naomi noticed it, that hesitation, small but real, and it gave her just enough ground to stand on. "Page 14, she said, quieter now, but more precise. Third paragraph, the liability clause shifts. Post-merger exposure entirely onto your firm." A few heads turned, not toward her, but toward their own copies of the document, pages flipping, fingers tracing lines they had skimmed minutes earlier, the room filling with the soft sound of paper and controlled breathing, and the man who had laughed first leaned forward, frowning now, his confidence thinning. "That clause is standard," he insisted, but his voice lacked the certainty it had seconds ago. Naomi did not argue. She did not raise her tone. She only added, "It looks standard, but the wording allows retroactive interpretation based on external compliance triggers, which means if anything goes wrong, even indirectly, you absorb the full financial impact." The words landed differently this time, not as interruption, but as possibility, and Daniel finally moved, not to sign, but to pull the document closer, his fingers pressing into the paper as his eyes scanned faster, sharper, the room watching him now instead of her, waiting for a reaction. They could follow, and across the table one of the legal advisors adjusted his glasses, leaning in, reading more carefully, his lips parting slightly as something caught his attention. "Hold on," he said, almost to himself, and the air shifted again, heavier, more focused, the earlier laughter fading into something distant and irrelevant. Naomi stayed where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her posture quiet but unyielding, because she knew this moment was no longer about being heard, it was about being right, and that was something they could not ignore. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried weight, his pen now resting on the table instead of above it, and when he looked up again, it was not at the executives who had been guiding him all morning, it was at her, measuring, recalculating, as if trying to understand how someone who had walked into the room unseen had just shifted the direction of a decision worth more than most people in that building would see in a lifetime. And for the first time, no one told her to be quiet. No one rushed to fill the silence this time. It deepened instead, settling over the table like a weight that pressed into every chair and every breath. And Naomi could hear it in the small details, the faint scratch of a pen being set down, the slow turn of a page, the almost imperceptible shift of leather as someone leaned forward, not out of arrogance anymore, but attention, real attention. And Daniel Whitmore did not look away from the contract as he spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Walk me through it," he said, not loudly, not formally, but directly to her. And the words seemed to land harder than any command he had given all morning, because they changed something fundamental. They gave her space, and the room felt it. A subtle fracture in the hierarchy that had defined every second before this one. Naomi hesitated for only a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from the sudden awareness that every person in that room was now listening, not waiting for her to fail, but waiting for her to prove something they could not yet name. And she stepped forward, just one step, enough to see the document clearly without reaching for it, her voice steady, measured. The clause references external compliance triggers. "Without defining limits," she said, her finger hovering just above the page without touching it, which means any regulatory change, even one unrelated to the merger itself, could be interpreted as a breach on your side. One of the advisors frowned deeper, adjusting his glasses again as he followed her words line by line, and another executive shifted in his seat, no longer relaxed, his posture tightening as the implications began to settle in. Naomi continued, not faster, not louder, but clearer. "And because the language allows retroactive enforcement, liability does not start at the point of failure. It reaches backward, attaching to any prior action that can be reclassified under new conditions." The room did not interrupt her this time. It absorbed her, every sentence landing with more weight than the last, and Daniel finally leaned back slightly, his hand moving away from the contract as if it no longer belonged to him in the same way, his expression no longer confident, but calculating, cautious, and for the first time uncertain. "That was not flagged," he said quietly, almost to himself, and the legal advisor across from him cleared his throat, a small, uncomfortable sound. "It appears the language is broader than standard," he admitted, choosing each word carefully, and the shift was undeniable now, not just in tone, but in control, because the conversation was no longer being directed from the head of the table, it was moving, recentering, pulling toward the one person who had not been invited to speak in the first place. Naomi did not look at the others. She kept her focus on the document, on the logic, on the structure that had revealed itself to her hours earlier under dim hallway lights and quiet floors. "If the deal closes as written," she added, "your firm carries full exposure while the opposing side retains flexibility to exit without consequence." A long pause followed, heavier than any before it, and Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table before going still, his gaze lifting slowly to meet hers again, not dismissive, not amused, but searching, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had assumed with the one now standing in front of him. And around them the room remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they no longer knew who should speak next. The shift did not come with a sound. It came with a posture, a subtle straightening of shoulders around the table, as people who had spent years leading conversations suddenly found themselves listening instead, and Naomi could feel it without looking up, the weight of attention settling on her in a way that was no longer dismissive but deliberate. And Daniel Whitmore leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers interlacing as if he needed to anchor himself before speaking. "If that is true," he said carefully, "then why was it structured this way?" The question was not a challenge, not entirely, but it carried the last trace of control he had not yet let go of, and Naomi lifted her eyes from the page to meet his, not with defiance, not with hesitation, but with a quiet clarity that made the room hold its breath again. "Because it benefits the side that wrote it," she replied, simple, direct, and impossible to dismiss. A faint exhale moved through the executives, not laughter this time, but recognition, the kind that comes when something obvious is finally spoken out loud. And one of the senior advisors shifted uncomfortably, his pen rolling between his fingers as he avoided eye contact. "This would need to be revised," he said, but the confidence in his voice had thinned to something cautious, something reactive, and Daniel's gaze sharpened, not at Naomi, but at the people who had guided him to this point. "Need to be revised," he repeated, slower, the words landing heavier now, "or should never have been presented this way." The difference was small in phrasing but massive in implication, and no one answered immediately, because there was no clean answer left to give. Naomi did not step back. She did not retreat into the role that had been assigned to her when she walked in. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, grounded, present, her voice steady as she continued. "There is another issue," she said, and the room responded before anyone spoke. A collective stillness that leaned toward her, ready, and she turned one page forward, careful not to touch the document directly. The exit clause appears balanced, but it includes a discretionary trigger tied to performance metrics that are not clearly defined. One of the analysts frowned, flipping to the same section, his eyes scanning faster now. "That means they can claim underperformance based on criteria that can shift after the agreement is signed," Naomi added, and the realization moved through the room in stages. First confusion, then calculation, then a quiet, sinking understanding of what that meant, and Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of how close he had been to a decision that would have locked him into a position with no leverage, no protection, and he leaned back again, this time more deliberately, creating space between himself and the contract as if distance alone could undo how close he had come. "Who reviewed this?" he asked, not loudly, but with a precision that made the question heavier than any raised voice, and the silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, but exposed, because the authority in the room had shifted completely, and Naomi stood in the center of it without raising her voice, without demanding attention, yet holding it entirely, and for the first time since the meeting began, the direction of the conversation did not come from the head of the table. It came from her, and no one tried to stop it. The question did not need to be repeated. It lingered in the air, pressing against every person at the table, and no one rushed to answer because the weight behind it had shifted from routine accountability to something sharper, something closer to exposure. And Daniel Whitmore did not look away this time, his gaze steady, waiting, not for a general response, but for a specific one. And across from him, one of the senior advisors cleared his throat, adjusting his cuff as if buying time. "It went through standard review," he said, but the words felt thinner than they should have, less like a statement and more like a placeholder. And Naomi could see it, the hesitation, the cracks forming not just in the deal, but in the confidence that had carried the room from the beginning. She did not interrupt. She did not rush. She simply let the silence stretch long enough for the truth to feel unavoidable. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, measured. "Standard review would have flagged both clauses," she said, not accusing, not defensive, just precise. And that precision made it harder to dismiss. One of the analysts leaned back slightly, exhaling as he ran a hand over his face, the kind of movement that signaled realization. Arriving too late, and Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table before going still again. A small motion, but deliberate. "Then it was not reviewed carefully enough," he said, And this time there was no softness in his tone, just clarity, the kind that cut through excuses before they could fully form. The room absorbed it, each person recalculating their position, their words, their silence, and Naomi remained where she was, not elevated by the shift, not diminished by it either, simply present in a way that felt unshakable. And Daniel turned his attention back to her, not as an afterthought, not as a curiosity, but as the central point of reference in a conversation that had moved entirely in her direction. "What else?" he asked, and the question carried something new, not authority alone, but trust, or at least the beginning of it. And Naomi did not hesitate. She had already seen the structure, already mapped the weak points in her mind hours before anyone else in that room had even opened the file. The financial projections assumed fixed regulatory conditions over a 36-month period, she said, her tone steady as she continued. But the compliance environment for this sector has shifted 3 times in the past 18 months, which means the assumptions are already outdated. A quiet murmur moved through the analysts, numbers being reprocessed, scenarios recalculated, and one of them leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he cross-checked the data. "She is right," he said under his breath, not intending to announce it. But the room heard him anyway, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but decisive, like a final piece falling into place. And Daniel leaned back again, this time with a different kind of stillness, not uncertainty, but control reclaimed through awareness rather than assumption, his gaze sweeping the table once before returning to Naomi, and for a brief moment the room felt suspended, as if waiting for him to reassert the structure that had existed before she spoke. But he did not. Instead, he said quietly, "Continue." And in that single word, the hierarchy that had defined the room from the beginning shifted completely, not loudly, not forcefully, but undeniably, because the conversation no longer belonged to the people who had started it. It belonged to the one who had understood it first. The word lingered longer than it should have, simple, quiet, but carrying a weight that reshaped the room in a way no raised voice ever could. And Naomi felt it settle into her chest, not as pressure, but as clarity, because there was no uncertainty left in what she needed to do, and she moved just slightly, enough to align herself with the table, not behind it, not outside of it, but within the space where decisions were being made, her eyes returning to the document as if the room itself had faded into the background. "The risk is not just in the clauses," she said, her tone even, deliberate. "It is in how they interact." A few executives exchanged quick glances, not dismissive anymore, but trying to follow, to keep up. And one of the analysts leaned closer, pen poised but unmoving, waiting. "The liability clause shifts responsibility forward and backward," she continued, "while the exit clause gives the other side a flexible path out, which means they can leave without consequence. After transferring the risk entirely to you," the explanation unfolded slowly, each piece connecting to the next, and the room did not interrupt. It listened, fully now, because what she was describing was no longer a possibility. It was a structure, a design, something intentional, and Daniel Whitmore's expression tightened just slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of the precision behind it. "So they are protected on both ends," he said, more to confirm than to challenge, and Naomi nodded once, small, controlled. "Yes, sir, they are protected before the deal, during the deal, and after the deal." The words landed clean, final, and the silence that followed was different again, not uncertain, not tense, but heavy with understanding. And one of the senior advisors shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence now replaced with a careful stillness. As if any movement might draw attention he could no longer deflect. "This would require a full renegotiation," he said. But even that sounded like an understatement now, and Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the contract as if seeing it for the first time. The clean lines, the structured language, the quiet traps hidden beneath it. And then he exhaled slowly, the sound steady, controlled. "It will not be signed," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that closed the door on everything that had come before, and the room absorbed it, some with relief, some with discomfort, all with the understanding that something irreversible had just happened. And Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, the silver tray now forgotten against the edge of the table, because the moment was no longer about her position in the room. It was about the truth she had brought into it. And Daniel finally looked up again, his eyes meeting hers with a different kind of focus, not evaluating, not questioning, but acknowledging. "You saw all of this from a single read," he said, and it was not disbelief. It was calculation, trying to understand the depth of what stood in front of him, and Naomi held his gaze, not for long, just enough. "Yes, sir," she answered, and for a brief second the room seemed to narrow, the distance between them shrinking in a way that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with recognition. And no one laughed, no one whispered, no one looked away, because the person they had dismissed at the start of the meeting had not just spoken, she had changed the outcome, and the room knew it. The decision settled over the room like a final note that could not be taken back, and for a moment no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because they were recalibrating to a reality that had shifted without warning, and Naomi could feel it in the silence, the kind that no longer questioned her presence, but quietly adjusted around it. And Daniel Whitmore remained still at the head of the table, his hand resting beside the unsigned contract, his gaze not on the document anymore but on her, studying, measuring something that went beyond the deal itself. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a different weight now, not casual curiosity, but intent. And Naomi felt the question land in a place deeper than the conversation, because it reached into the part of her story that did not belong to this room, not to the polished glass, not to the tailored suits, but to late nights, to borrowed light, to moments where no one was watching, and she answered simply, "I read what I could find." Her tone even, not defensive, not proud, just true, and a faint shift moved through the room again, subtle but real, as if that answer disrupted expectations in a way they had not prepared for. One of the executives leaned back, exhaling slowly as he folded his hands together, no longer trying to reassert control, but absorbing the outcome, while another glanced down at the document, flipping pages with less urgency now, more like confirmation than discovery, and Daniel nodded once, small, deliberate, as if placing that piece into a larger picture he was beginning to see. "You read this last night," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion, and Naomi gave a slight nod. "Yes, sir." The exchange was quiet, but it shifted something again, because it reframed the moment from interruption to preparation, from accident to intention, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, his posture no longer rigid, but composed in a different way, grounded in awareness rather than assumption, his fingers tapping lightly once against the table before going still. "And you understood it better than the people who were paid to review it," he added, the statement hanging in the air without accusation, but with undeniable implication, and no one spoke to challenge it, because there was nothing left to challenge. The evidence had already unfolded in front of them, and Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood that anything she said now would carry more weight than before, and she chose her words carefully. "I paid attention to what it allowed, not just what it said, and that landed differently than everything before, because it was not just analysis, it was perspective, a way of seeing that could not be easily taught or replicated." And Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show recognition, not just of her ability, but of the gap it revealed in the system around him. And he glanced briefly at the others before returning his focus to her. "That kind of attention changes outcomes," he said quietly, almost to himself, and the room remained still, not because it lacked movement, but because it no longer needed it. The momentum had already shifted, and Naomi stood there, no longer an outsider at the edge of the room, but not fully inside it either, existing in a space that had been created in real time by clarity and courage. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one questioned why she was there, only what would happen next. The question did not fade after it was asked. It stayed in the room, quiet but persistent, threading through the stillness like something unfinished, and Naomi could feel it pressing against the edges of her thoughts, not as pressure, but as a turning point she had not planned for, because until that moment, everything had been about the contract, about the flaw, about the truth hidden in plain sight. But now the focus had shifted to her, and that was something she had spent years learning how to avoid, and yet she did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. She simply stood there, steady, grounded in the same calm that had carried her this far, while Daniel Whitmore watched her with a focus that no longer searched for mistakes, but for understanding. "What else would you change?" he asked, and the room responded before she did. A subtle lean forward. A collective adjustment, as if everyone present had silently agreed that the conversation now belonged to her, and Naomi glanced once more at the document, not because she needed to, but because it anchored her, gave her a structure to follow in a space that had suddenly opened wider than she expected. "The structure assumes control remains centralized," she said, her voice even, measured. "But the clauses distribute decision-making power in ways that are not visible at first glance." One of the analysts nodded almost unconsciously, recognizing the pattern she was describing, and she continued, "If you proceed with this framework, you will appear to lead the deal, but operational authority will shift outward over time." The words settled slowly, each one connecting to the next, and Daniel's expression tightened just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the deeper implication. "So it is not just about risk," he said, more quietly now. "It is about control." And Naomi met his gaze briefly, just long enough to confirm, "Yes, sir." And that confirmation seemed to land heavier than everything before it, because it reframed the entire agreement, not as a partnership, but as a transfer, something designed to look balanced while quietly shifting power away. And the room absorbed it in silence. No one rushing to speak, no one attempting to redirect, because the clarity had already moved beyond argument. And Daniel leaned forward again, his hand resting lightly on the table, not near the contract this time, but between them, as if marking a different center for the conversation. "And if we had signed it," he said, the question unfinished but understood, and Naomi did not hesitate. "You would have carried the risk, lost flexibility, and slowly given up control without realizing it until it was too late to reverse." Her tone did not change. It did not dramatize the outcome. It simply stated it, and that made it harder to ignore, harder to soften. And one of the executives exhaled slowly, shaking his head just once as if clearing something he could not quite name, while another stared at the table, fingers still, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, because there was nothing left to rush toward. And Daniel sat back again, his posture composed, but different now, grounded in awareness rather than momentum, and he looked at her, not as someone who had interrupted his meeting, but as someone who had redirected it entirely. "You saw all of that from one document," he said, and Naomi gave the smallest nod, and in that moment, the room did not feel divided between who belonged and who did not. It felt redefined, shaped by the one person who had chosen to speak when silence would have been easier, and no one in that room could pretend they had not heard her. No one spoke immediately after her words settled, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been revealed, and Naomi could feel the shift deepening, not just in the tone of the room, but in the way people held themselves, the way they looked at the table instead of at her, as if recalculating not only the deal but their own place within it. And Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his gaze steady, not searching anymore, but deciding. And when he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, his hand sliding the contract away from the center of the table, as if removing something that no longer belonged there. "We are done with this version," he said quietly, and the words did not need emphasis. They carried their own finality. And a few heads nodded, not out of agreement, but acceptance, the kind that comes when the outcome is no longer up for debate. And Naomi stood where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence now part of the room in a way that could not be undone. And Daniel's attention returned to her again, not briefly this time, but fully, as if the next part of the conversation mattered just as much as everything that had come before. "If you were sitting here," he said, gesturing lightly to the table, "what would you do differently?" The question shifted. The air again, not sharply, but enough to be felt, because it was no longer about identifying problems, it was about shaping direction. And Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from uncertainty, but from the awareness of what that question implied. And then she answered, her voice steady, grounded in the same clarity that had guided her from the beginning. "I would define the limits clearly," she said. Every clause that shifts risk or authority needs boundaries that cannot be reinterpreted later. One of the analysts nodded slowly, already thinking through the revisions, and she continued, I would align liability with control, so the party making decisions carries the responsibility for them. The logic unfolded naturally, not forced, not rehearsed, just consistent, and the room followed, not interrupting, not redirecting, simply absorbing. And Daniel listened without breaking eye contact, his posture still, his expression focused, as if each word was being measured not just for accuracy, but for something deeper, something harder to quantify. And I would remove any language that allows one side to exit without consequence while the other remains exposed, she added, and that final point settled with a quiet weight, because it addressed not just the structure of the deal, but the imbalance at its core, and a long pause followed. Not empty, but full, as if the room itself needed a moment to adjust to the new shape of the conversation, and Daniel leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the table, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, just still, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured than before. You are not trained for this, he said, not as a dismissal, but as an observation, and Naomi met his gaze, calm, unshaken. No, sir, she replied, and there was no apology in her tone, no hesitation, just truth. And something in that answer seemed to settle differently than everything else, because it removed any illusion, any expectation that her presence could be explained by the usual paths, and Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he could not ignore, and around them the room remained silent, not because they had nothing to contribute, but because the conversation had already moved beyond them. And for the first time since the meeting began, it was clear to everyone present that the person who had walked in unnoticed was now the one shaping what would happen next. The words did not echo, they settled, quiet and steady, and for a moment Daniel Whitmore did not respond, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood that anything he said next would define more than just the direction of the deal. It would define the line between what had been assumed and what was now undeniable, and he looked at Naomi not as an interruption anymore, not even as a surprise, but as a variable he had not accounted for, something that did not fit the structure he trusted, yet had just exposed its weakness with precision he could not ignore, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting flat against the table, grounding himself in a space that had shifted beneath him. Then training is not the point, he said slowly, more to himself than to the room. And a faint movement passed through the executives, a subtle recognition that the conversation had moved beyond credentials, beyond roles, into something less defined but more real, and Naomi remained. Still, her posture calm, her presence steady, not pressing forward, not pulling back, simply holding the space she had stepped into. And Daniel's gaze moved briefly to the others, not seeking approval, not asking for input, but measuring the silence that had replaced their earlier certainty, and he understood it. They had nothing left to offer that had not already been reshaped by what she had revealed, and when his eyes returned to her, there was no hesitation left in them, only decision. You saw what we missed, he said, and the statement carried no edge, no defensiveness, only fact, and Naomi met his gaze for a brief moment, not to challenge, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge. And that acknowledgement carried more weight than agreement ever could, and Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that released something unseen but heavy, the kind of tension that builds when a decision is made too quickly and almost goes unnoticed. We would have signed it, he added quietly, and no one in the room corrected him, no one softened the statement, because it was true, and the realization settled deeper than any of the clauses they had just examined. And Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, because she understood what that meant, not just for the company, but for the people sitting around that table, for the trust they placed in systems that were not always as solid as they appeared. And Daniel watched her for a moment longer, then shifted his posture again, this time not as someone recovering control, but as someone redefining it. If you had not spoken, he said, and the sentence lingered unfinished. Because the outcome did not need to be stated again, it was already understood, and he paused, just long enough for the weight of that truth to settle fully, before continuing. This would have gone through. and the room absorbed it in silence, a silence that no longer questioned her presence, but quietly recognized its impact. And Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table before stilling again, a habit now softened, less about impatience and more about thought. And then he made a decision that did not require raising his voice, did not require explanation, but carried a shift that everyone felt. "Pull the deal," he said, turning slightly toward his team, and this time there was no hesitation in their response. Only quick, quiet movement as notes were taken, calls mentally prepared, adjustments already beginning to form, and Naomi stood there, watching it unfold, not as an outsider witnessing something distant, but as someone who had set it in motion. And Daniel looked back at her one more time, his expression composed but no longer distant. "You did not have to say anything," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, not just acknowledgement, but something closer to respect. And Naomi held his gaze for a second, then answered simply, "I knew what it meant if I did not." And that answer did not rise, did not demand attention, but it settled deeper than anything else she had said, because it revealed not just what she saw, but why she chose to speak. And in that moment, the room understood something beyond contracts and clauses, something quieter, but far more difficult to ignore. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be folded back into routine or dismissed as a momentary disruption. And Naomi could feel it in the way people moved now, quieter, more deliberate, as if every action carried a new awareness they had not possessed before. And Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze drifting briefly to the contract that had nearly been signed, then away again, as if the paper itself no longer deserved his attention. And when he finally stood, it was not abrupt, not commanding, but measured, controlled, the kind of movement that signaled the decision had settled fully into place. "We will reconvene with a revised structure," he said, his voice steady, directed to the room but shaped by what had just occurred, and heads nodded, not out of habit, but agreement grounded in understanding. And one by one, the executives began to gather their materials, closing folders, aligning papers, the soft sounds of transition replacing the earlier tension. But no one rushed. No one tried to reclaim the pace that had existed before, because the rhythm of the room had changed, and Naomi remained where she was, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the silver tray now almost forgotten, an object from a role that no longer defined her place in that moment. And Daniel turned toward her again, not immediately, not impulsively, but with intention, as if choosing the right moment to bridge the distance that had existed between them at the start. "Walk with me," he said, his tone calm, not a command, but not a request either, something in between, something that assumed presence rather than questioned it. And for a brief second, the room seemed to pause again, not visibly, but in the way attention shifted, subtle, unspoken, as Naomi stepped forward, not hesitating, not rushing, simply moving with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through everything so far. And together they moved toward the far side of the room, away from the table, away from the contract, toward the glass wall that overlooked the city below, the skyline stretching wide, buildings catching the light in sharp angles that reflected the clarity now settling between them. And Daniel stood there for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table behind him, his gaze directed outward, but his focus clearly elsewhere. "You changed the outcome of a deal worth more than most people in this building will ever understand," he said, not turning yet, his voice lower now, more reflective. And Naomi stood a step behind him, her posture steady, her presence quiet but grounded. "I did what made sense," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to land deeper than anything more elaborate could have. And Daniel let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just measured, as if aligning his thoughts with something new, something he had not expected to confront today. And when he turned to face her again, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, no hint of the distance that had defined their first interaction, only a clear, direct attention that acknowledged what had happened without trying to reduce it. "People in that room are paid to see what you saw," he said, and the statement carried no accusation now, only recognition. And Naomi met his gaze briefly, then lowered it slightly, not out of discomfort, but thought. because she understood what he was really saying, not about them, but about her and the space she had stepped into. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but full, carrying the weight of a shift that could not be undone. And somewhere behind them, the last of the executives filed out, the door closing softly, leaving the room quieter than it had been all morning, not empty, but changed. And Naomi stood there, no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed, but not fully defined either, suspended in a moment where what came next had yet to be decided. And for the first time since she had walked in, the question was not whether she belonged in that room, but what she would choose to do with the space she had just created. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like the room itself was holding its breath for what would come next. And Naomi stood still, the city stretching beyond the glass in long lines of steel and light, her reflection faint against it, a figure that had walked in unnoticed and now stood at the center of something that could not be undone. And Daniel Whitmore watched her for a moment longer, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with a kind of patience that had not been present before, as if he understood that whatever came next could not be rushed. "You said you read what you could find," he said finally, his voice low, measured, and Naomi nodded once, small, controlled. "Yes, sir." And he studied her for a second, as if mapping that answer against everything he had just seen, trying to understand how far it reached, how much of what she knew had been built in silence, outside of rooms like this one. "And no one taught you," he continued, not as a challenge, but as a confirmation. And Naomi let out a slow breath, her gaze shifting briefly to the city before returning to him. "No one had time," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than explanation ever could, because it did not ask for sympathy. It did not justify anything. It simply stated what was, and Daniel nodded once, slower this time, as if acknowledging not just the words, but everything behind them, the hours, the effort, the discipline it took to see what others had overlooked. And he turned slightly, resting one hand against the table, grounding himself again. "There is a difference between information and understanding," he said, more to himself than to her. "Most people in that room had the information," and he paused, letting the thought settle before finishing. "You had the understanding." And the distinction hung in the air, quiet but undeniable, and Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she knew that what he was saying was not just about the contract, it was about the space she had stepped into, and the way she had moved within it. And Daniel looked at her again, his expression steady, composed, but carrying something new, something that had not been there at the start. "You do not belong in the role you walked in with," he said. And there was no judgment in it, no dismissal, only recognition. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then lowered it slightly, not out of hesitation, but thought, because she understood what he meant and what it implied. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was full, carrying the weight of possibility that neither of them named yet. And somewhere in the distance, a faint sound of movement echoed from the hallway outside, the world continuing as it always did, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside that room. And Daniel straightened slightly, his posture settling into something more defined, more intentional. "If you had stayed quiet," he said, not finishing the sentence again, because he did not need to. And Naomi gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the truth of it without adding to it. And for a moment they both stood there, the distance between them no longer defined by position or title, but by something less tangible, something that had been revealed through action rather than words. And then Daniel made a decision, not with force, not with urgency, but with clarity. "Come back tomorrow," he said, his voice steady. "Not as staff," he added, after a brief pause, as if choosing the words carefully, "as someone who sees what others miss." And the offer did not sound like an invitation. It sounded like a recognition of something already proven. And Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this moment, like everything else that had happened, was not just about opportunity, it was about choice. And she stood there, steady, grounded, her reflection still faint in the glass behind her, knowing that whatever she said next would not just change her place in that building, but the direction of everything that followed. Naomi did not answer right away, not because she doubted what she had heard, but because she understood the weight behind it, the kind of weight that did not come often and never came lightly, and she let the silence sit between them for a moment, steady and unbroken, her eyes drifting once more to the city beyond the glass where everything moved as it always had, cars tracing slow lines below, people walking with purpose she could not see from this height, a world that had not changed even though hers had just shifted in a way she could not ignore, and she drew in a quiet breath, grounding herself in something familiar, something that did not depend on titles or rooms or who was watching. "I will be here," she said finally, her voice calm, certain, not rushed, not hesitant. And Daniel Whitmore nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, as if the answer confirmed something he had already decided. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by a quiet understanding that had formed without effort, without force, simply through what had happened. And then Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating, just shifting, returning to the edge of the room where she had started, but not as the same person who had stood there before. And Daniel watched her as she moved, not with scrutiny, but with awareness, as if marking the difference between who she had been when she walked in and who she had become in the span of a single conversation. And he turned back toward the table, his gaze resting briefly on the contract that now lay untouched, a document that had nearly changed everything. And he let out a slow breath, the kind that carried both relief and recognition, before gathering it with a quiet motion and setting it aside, not discarded, but no longer relevant. And Naomi picked up the silver tray again, her fingers settling around the cool metal, the familiar weight grounding her even as everything else had shifted, and she walked toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor the only thing breaking the silence. And just before she reached it, she paused, not turning, not speaking, just standing there for a second longer as if marking the moment in a way no one else could see. And then she opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, where the noise of the building returned in quiet layers, distant conversations, the hum of movement, the ordinary rhythm of a place that had no idea what had just unfolded inside that room. And the door closed softly behind her, sealing the space she had changed. And inside, Daniel remained still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the empty space where she had stood, not because he expected her to return, but because he understood that something had been left behind, something that would not fade when the room filled again. And the next morning would come like any other, with meetings, schedules, decisions waiting to be made. But it would not be the same, because he would remember the moment a voice he had almost ignored had shifted everything. And he would remember the stillness that followed when truth did not need to be loud to be undeniable. And somewhere down the hallway, Naomi walked forward with the same quiet pace, the tray still in her hands, her reflection passing in and out of the glass panels along the corridor, no longer invisible, not because anyone had said it, but because she knew it. And that was enough, because she had not come into that room to be seen. She had come in to do what was right. And in doing so, she had changed something far greater than a single deal. She had changed the way one man would listen the next time a voice like hers chose to speak. And the building carried on, unaware, unchanged on the surface, but somewhere within it, a single moment had rewritten what power looked like, not loud, not forceful, but clear, steady, and impossible to ignore.